And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me as he always does is Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you again.
Bob, great seeing you.
So explain to me what this was about in Iraq with U.S. helicopters and some soldiers and some aid workers. What were they doing there?
The U.S. was trying to assess what the humanitarian crisis looked like on Mount Sinjar. This is where the Yazidi population had retreated to, or at least a portion of that population, and had been encircled by the Islamic State fighters. And so what had happened over the last few days was not just airdrops, humanitarian drops, MREs, that kind of thing, to the population, but also attempts to get some of these members of that community off the mountain, working with the Kurds. The assessment on top of that mountain was special forces operators trying to figure out what was going on. And their assessment is that there is no need for a mass evacuation, that the numbers are lower than they had thought, the population is more stable than they had realized, and therefore there's no need for kind of a mass effort to depopulate that mountain. Now, the Kurds have said otherwise. The Kurds have said, look, we still need help to this population, and it's not over. And so we'll just have to see how it plays out. But for the short term, it appears that any prospect of a heavy American footprint to get those people off the mountain will not happen.
So because of the airstrikes, knocking ISIS back a bit,
right,
and because of the food drops, then I guess escapes by night by these people on
That's
the mountain,
right,
this has now been diffused a little bit.
That's right. I think the sense of immediate urgency is lifted a bit, certainly here in Washington. The problem, though, as you know, Bob, is this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the humanitarian disaster and refugee problem in Kurdistan. Kurdistan has become now the refuge in Iraq, in particular in the north, for those populations that have been pushed out of their villages and towns by the Islamic State. The Christians, for example, that have had to evacuate from Mosul or other towns that have been taken over by these Islamic terrorists. And so the beginning of the refugee crisis is now starting. And this is why you've started to see countries like France and the UK say, look, we're not only going to come help the U.S. in terms of what's going on in Mount Sinjar, but we're going to help with what is a refugee problem. And the UN has now called Iraq an emergency situation at the highest level that the UN can label it. And so that's now at the category of South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and these other disaster zones around the world.
So my question is this kind of a template of other things that might happen down the line, or was this a one-off? I mean, would somebody look at this and say, this was successful, targeted airstrikes, food drops? I mean, is that an answer to fixing the refugee crisis, or is that just kind of a Band-Aid?
Well, it's certainly a Band-Aid to the overarching refugee problem, but it was a solution to this particular problem, which was an encircled particular population on this mountain, and you had to obviously dislodge the encirclement by the Islamic extremists, and you had to get these people food and literally get them off the mountain. So in many ways, it was a physically and psychologically isolated incident. But I think the important point here, Bob, is that the refugee problem and the humanitarian crisis is not over. And the Kurds are going to have to deal with this with American, French, British, and international assistance.
So quickly, as we wrap this up, what are the options with dealing with that? I mean, what could be done?
Well, you've seen this already play out in the Syrian context with literally millions leaving the Syrian conflict zones into places like Jordan and Turkey. Jordan now has certain refugee camps that are as big as some of their largest cities. And so what you may end up seeing in Kurdistan are encampments created, refugee centers and villages outside of Erbil and in key zones to actually house these people for the long term. Because until you dislodge ISIS, these people aren't going to be able to go back home. They would be killed. And so the encirclement of Mount Sinjar is just the start of the problem, because you've got, in some ways, the encirclement of Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq by this Islamic State.
So this is a short-term tactical victory, but very localized, very isolated.
Very isolated, and just the start of the problem.
Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.